we're going to look closely at the source material to understand exactly how radical Islamist ideologies justify violence against all Jews. We'll be relying heavily on academic sources, like Shaul Bartal's work, Jihad in Palestine, to neutrally examine the frameworks these radical Islamist organizations actually use. By looking directly at their very own words, their covenants, and their sermons, we can get a much clearer picture of how they construct a worldview that doesn't just permit violence, but actively mandates it.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the ideological foundation, then look at how they redefine jihad and martyrdom, explore the weapon of dehumanization, touch on apocalyptic prophecies, and finally, look at why all of this totally rejects the idea of political compromise.
Let's jump into Section 1, the ideological foundation, beyond a territorial dispute. Right off the bat, the sources point out a really critical distinction. For groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, this conflict is not viewed as just some political or territorial dispute over borders that you can simply draw on a map. Instead, it's framed as a rigid religious mandate. The texts actually describe it as a cosmic battle between good and evil, where the land itself is considered a sacred, holy endowment. What does that mean in practice? Well, it means any concession isn't seen as a political compromise, it's seen as a direct betrayal of faith. That brings us to Section 2, redefining jihad and martyrdom, the mandate for violence. It's fascinating and deeply unsettling to see how historical, theological concepts get actively weaponized here. According to the primary texts, these radical groups totally redefine the concept of jihad. While a lot of scholars and practicing Muslims view jihad primarily as an internal, spiritual struggle to just be a better person, radical organizations explicitly define it as a literal, violent war. The charters of groups like Hamas basically state that once land is perceived as occupied, violent jihad becomes the practical, everyday duty of every single individual. So it shifts entirely from a spiritual concept to a strictly militaristic one. And right alongside that militant interpretation of jihad is the concept of istishhad, or martyrdom. The literature turns the act of violent self-sacrifice into the absolute highest religious aspiration you could possibly achieve. It's not presented as a tragic loss of life, no. It's framed as a guaranteed VIP pathway to paradise, offering absolute forgiveness of sins and the ultimate honor for the person's family. The sources highlight literature that praises martyrdom to a frankly incredible degree. There's this one quote that promises such a massive, profound reward in the afterlife that the martyr would supposedly return to Earth just to get killed for the cause all over again. This kind of ideology fundamentally devalues earthly life, making the ultimate sacrifice not just acceptable, but something highly, highly desirable.
Moving on to Section 3, the weapon of dehumanization. Removing moral barriers.
Now, you might be wondering, how on earth do these groups convince ordinary individuals to carry out such horrific, violent acts against civilians? The academic research points to a very specific, calculated strategy: systematic dehumanization. Highly toxic tropes are used relentlessly in their sermons, broadcasts, and literature to explicitly demonize opponents, particularly all Jews. They frame them as agents of evil, compare them to animals like apes and pigs, or label them a literal virus. And this is crucial, because when the enemy is no longer viewed as human, the psychological and moral barriers to committing extreme violence against them simply vanish. To put that into perspective, look at the framing from primary sources. When an opponent is literally associated with the devil, violence isn't just some tactical, political choice anymore. It becomes a moral imperative. You are eradicating an inherent evil from the world. In their own ideological framework, this completely legitimizes their actions. All right, Section 4, Apocalyptic Visions and Prophecies, a Cosmic Necessity. This ideological framework expands way, way beyond day-to-day politics. It actually reaches deep into apocalyptic prophecies. For instance, Article 7 of the Hamas Charter contains a specific prophecy stating that the end of times literally cannot happen until a final, violent confrontation occurs. It explicitly frames violence against all Jews not as some localized political strategy, but as a cosmic necessity. Even the natural world, the stones and trees, are depicted as actively participating in this mandate. The academic texts reveal that this worldview portrays the destruction of their enemies as a mandatory stepping stone to the Islamic day of resurrection, which is often referred to as the hour. In this mindset, violence is quite literally a divine prerequisite for the salvation of the world. Which brings us to our final section, rejecting political compromise, the barrier to peace. Let's look at the practical, real-world fallout of this worldview.
The sources make a brilliant comparison here between two very different types of conflict. In a traditional political or territorial conflict, sides fight over land or resources, right? But the ultimate goal is usually a treaty or a compromise. However, in an apocalyptic or ideological conflict, the fight is for a non-negotiable religious mandate. When your goals are ordained by the divine, a political compromise isn't just a bad deal at the negotiating table, it's viewed as outright heresy.
And honestly, historically, we can see a very clear, undeniable pattern. The sources document how acts of extreme violence are frequently and deliberately timed to sabotage political peace processes. From the rise of these groups in the 1980s to the targeted attacks in the mid-90s aimed at completely shattering the Oslo Accords, to the waves of bombings in the 2000s, the violence spikes precisely when political dialogue threatens to actually yield a compromise.
It all feeds into this cohesive, honestly devastating strategy. Terrorism, in this context, is used as an asymmetrical tactic. The goal is to intensify hostility, deliberately provoke retaliatory military strikes, and basically force a never-ending cycle of revenge. By inflaming moderates on both sides, they ensure that coming to the negotiating table remains politically impossible for absolutely everyone involved.
So, based on all the academic texts and primary sources we've just unpacked today, we are left with a profoundly difficult question. If traditional diplomacy relies on both parties being willing to give up something to gain peace, how can those mechanisms possibly function when one faction operates on a cosmic ideology that views the very concept of compromise as a betrayal of the divine?